Angela emailed from Baltimore, an American Baptist associate minister. Question, she says, so I really feel like the liturgical calendar has been occupied by capitalism. We skip all the waiting of Advent. We have more church members attend Mammon's Black Friday sunrise service than the celebration of the defeat of death, and we let Coca-Cola tell us what our subversive St. Nicholas was really about, and we continue to play this game with our kids and tell them that dressing up on Christmas is the most Christian thing to do. How can the Occupy movement help us envision a liturgical season? In light of the Occupy movement, how could we re-envision the liturgical season of Advent?
We occupied last November Black Friday on the plaza by we were arrested. 16 from the Interfaith Tent were arrested in the second raid and spent the day in jail. We went right back down there with a canopy, and they told us we couldn't have a canopy. So we went back down there with an umbrella. We thought, well, surely an umbrella isn't illegal. So we had an umbrella down there for several weeks until they did the same thing. They confiscated the umbrella. I have to go to court November 28th about this illegal umbrella. But we put up, we on Black Friday, we opened a free store, and we invited people to just bring stuff and give it away. Whatever they didn't want anymore, trinkets, clothes, bedding. The most popular thing was socks. Homeless people need socks. In fact, a woman came and took 3 pairs. She said, I now have Christmas presents for my kids. So that's one way to disrupt it, is to take the whole commercialization out of it and make it a season of generosity. Because in some sense, Advent is it's not just about waiting, but it's also about a season of generosity. So that's one thing I would do. I also was part of a church in Minneapolis at one point that used that whole Advent season to talk about the blessedness of darkness, the blessedness of sleep and rest and rainbows from the full moon. And so sort of just to shift that whole emphasis on getting ready for Christmas Day and moved into what the space of dark would feel like as a positive thing. Because mostly in Christian cultures, we tend to think of darkness as a bad thing, but there's so many things that are dark: coffee, chocolate, but also night. We don't tend to pay attention to that. Those are ways to slow it down. To think about the value of darkness actually sort of slows down that Advent energy.
The congregations tend to move through the liturgical calendar almost like watching a movie. You like it, but you know the ending, right? And so to recover some sense of, where the disciples genuinely thought that Friday was it, that Good Friday was it, right? That's, that Sunday morning just wasn't expected. So we tend to go into Good Friday kind of knowing that, yeah, this is bad, but, we're going to get to the good stuff, right? But to recover some sense of that, the real unexpected nature of Advent and the liturgical calendar.
Mm-hmm. It seems that my congregants would rather just pick another church and instead of wrestle with the text long enough to be converted to the gospel. Advice for us who have learned so much from the people you're talking to and are now in a world, much like Reiger described, of occupied images of God.
This is really a great question because it asks us some serious questions about conversion. Christianity ultimately is not just about living same old, and being happier, but it's about living differently, living a different life. Now, think all the way back to the disciples. There were some people that were privileged to know Jesus personally. They were called by him, they followed him. But if you remember that story, it took them a long time to understand what was going on. So conversion wasn't a one-time thing. Read the Gospel of Mark and follow the person of Peter, and he's not getting it for a long time. Then he gets it at one moment, he loses it again. Now, what I'm saying here, what I'm suggesting is the only way you can really learn this and you can really then become a Christian in that way is to be on the road with Jesus. The question then is not what would Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing, and to walk alongside. Now, for the disciples, it took a long time to figure it out. I don't expect us to learn it much quicker. But without walking with Jesus, we're not going to ever learn it. So here, I think the challenge of the Occupy movement is, here's a context where people are marching, where they're walking, and they're walking in all kinds of different ways. Recently, we've heard about Occupy Sandy. People are walking in order to support people that were hurt by this storm, by the hurricane. There are other ways. There's Occupy Homes, people organizing neighborhoods to prevent foreclosures, to keep people in their houses. Now, don't think of this only as acts of social justice. Think of those as acts where God is walking, where Jesus is walking. What is Jesus doing now? The most unlikely answer of that is sitting in church all the time. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus is not to be found in church, but to think that Jesus is mainly sitting in church and then to expect the conversion to come from that, it's not going to happen. So the challenge here is, how do we walk together with Jesus and our fellow human beings, and not narrowly conceived? No, it's not just people like us. That's the beauty of the Occupy movement. Some of the stories, that Rita told about Oakland is how diverse some of these movements are. Not all of them are diverse, but this is another challenge. We can grow more diverse. We can include more people. But that's the way towards conversion, I believe.
One of the opportunities, I would say, the opportunities for conversion that in Oakland the Occupy movement provided was at every General Assembly. And the General Assemblies were not just the occupiers who were sleeping in the tents in the plaza. It was people from all over the Bay Area. They were kind of curious about Oakland, and so they would come to a General Assembly, and the facilitators would always say, okay, who's new and who's never been to a General Assembly? And every single one, somebody or a whole group of people, like a whole church, would come down and raise their hand because they'd never been to one. So the rules about all the hand signals and the mic check and all that had to be explained. But what would happen is that people would be sitting in the plaza in these concrete benches in this amphitheater around a lot of people that they didn't know, and there might be guys from the hood, and they had a smoking section where stuff was going, and then there was this other section for kids, and then people would come, and there would be something that needed discussion, some resolution, some proposal to the General Assembly that was kind of controversial or just people needed to talk about it, and the facilitators would just say, find 20 people or find 10 people and make a group and talk about it. And so people would sit with strangers and start talking about something that actually mattered. And to talk about things that deeply matter with people that you don't even know is an amazing thing. You're often surprised by what people think. But I don't know how many times I sat in a group like that and I got my mind changed. I actually thought differently about it. And one of those that happened in Oakland that was profound, that was an ongoing conversation, happened in a number of General Assemblies, was whether we were going to make a statement about nonviolence. Because some occupies made a statement that their practices were nonviolent. And we got into, it changed my opinion about it. I was, for a while, very frustrated that they wouldn't do it. But as I began to hear what some people were saying about it, I thought, okay, well, I shouldn't get too much on my high horse about this, people breaking windows, because that was the violence we were talking about, people breaking windows, not hurting people, breaking windows at demonstrations. And somebody said, well, in the 60s, all these religious people went in and they went and broke into federal buildings and they burned draft files. They destroyed property. That was not regarded as violence by that movement. And it made me think. And I think that that's part of being converted, is not getting comfortable with your own set opinions because you're actually with people different from you that you want to be with. And to be with them, you have to listen. You have to do what I call deep listening.
Deep solidarity and deep listening. So the preacher is ready to come up with the third deep, right? Yeah. So Greg from St. Paul, last question. He said, if I invited y'all to my church for a tent revival in the summer, because I guess you don't have them in St. Paul other times, And our requested title was Occupy the Church. What text would you pick? How would you preach it? What walk the aisle invitation would you give? Oh, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist.
It's an excellent question. I do like thinking about the tents that we saw in the Occupy movement, and to think about God as tabernacling with us, right? Literally a kind of tenting with us, right? To recover that kind of language, and to recover that, and to understand kind of the economic aspects of so much of our religious language. I often tell people I learned more about theology when I was once a loan officer. Right? We used to say, we used to use the language of making the bank whole, right? Reconciliation, redemption, all of that kind of, and to recover. I mean, it's in some ways it's already there within the liturgical aspects of the life of the church. Language such as you've been bought with a price, right? The language of ransom, all of these kinds of languages, and I think even in a sermonic, liturgical way, there's ways to use the language that's already there, and also to be attentive to, and I kind of want to echo the theme of conversion. In my own experience, watching someone who once was a millionaire file bankruptcy, and over the course of 2 or 3 years have to regain their identity and understand who they were outside of that person, right? And that was a long, painful process, right? And the kind of shame that gets internalized with that. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which the language that is already in the church can be used effectively.
There are two important women theologians that we don't oftentimes acknowledge. One in the Old Testament, her name is Hannah. The other one in the New, her name is Mary, happens to be the mother of Jesus as well. And they're having some powerful things to say. Very often we think of Mary as always being long-suffering, patient, quiet, perhaps a bit tearful, but certainly not a radical theologian. Now, there's this text in the Gospel of Luke in the beginning, Mary's song of praise, where she talks about how God looked upon the lowliness of his servant, how he raised her up, how he fills the hungry with good things. That's a very powerful sermon, I think, that really is going to make a difference. Now, there is something in that sermon that we often overlook, though. When Mary talks about lifting up the lowly, she also talks about a God who pushes the powerful from their thrones. Mm-hmm. When she talks about filling the hungry with good things, eating with the hungry, feeding, they can eat themselves. We don't have to feed them, really. When she talks about these sorts of things, she also talks about the one who fills the hungry with good things, sends the rich away empty. Now, that sounds cruel, that sounds mean, how can you be so mean to the 1%? I wonder if this is the only way that you can get saved if you're among the 1%, if you get sent away once in a while, if you get pushed from your throne once in a while. Because then you can learn that you're not God, that you're not in control, that maybe something else is going that you haven't ever been paying attention to. And so at that point, I think Mary and Hannah, the mother of Samuel in the Old Testament, really have something to teach to us that may be hard to preach, that may be hard to hear, especially for those of us who feel like we're better off. But that may be the only thing that would ultimately save us and lift all the lowly up in new ways.